Only I can't hear you.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Anthony Peake Consciousness Hour. We've had a little bit of a challenge getting this working in the sense that the Archons clearly were aware of the fact that we were going to be trying to go live. My Wi-Fi went down within 2 minutes of me actually setting up the Zoom meeting. And then the people across the road's builders decided to start cutting metal. But they seem to have stopped at the moment. So fingers crossed, it'll work quite well for us. I've been looking forward to this show for such a long time because both of my guests are people I admire so much. And our subject matter today will be Shakespeare and the occult and the mysterious. And I found it quite strange, actually. I've just come back from California where I was doing an event at Contact in the Desert in Indian Wells in the Californian desert. And the last event I did, I was on stage together with a group of other individuals, including such luminaries as Graham Hancock, doing a panel on a subject that really is of no importance to this. But when I was on the stage, I was reminded of my very first stage performance, and I thought how life comes around. In that stage performance, I acted in a school for a school that's now known as Plessington on the Wirral, and I acted in Shakespeare's Twelfth Night. And I do remember a very beautiful hot summer's evening way back in the summer of 1969, being taken by our school teacher, the lady that was actually doing the play for us, the lady that was directing the play. And she had this most beautiful house on the banks of the River Dee, very, very close to where Alan is now joining us in a place called Heswell. And it was one of those most idyllic evenings. And it reminded me in many ways of how Shakespeare can be so magical in the way it's put across. And Twelfth Night is a comedy, but it's still very magical. And I think when we were in the gardens of this lady's house and we were acting in the gardens, it just had this timelessness. And in fact, and then I was thinking, my God, and all these years later, here I am, this little working class kid talking to hundreds of people in the deserts in California. And I thought, isn't life strange and curious? But whenever I think about Shakespeare, one of my favorite movies is a wonderful Woody Allen adaptation of A Midsummer Night's Dream called A Midsummer Night's Sex Comedy. And that, whenever I watch that film, it reminds me of those gardens, because if you've seen the movie, it's magical. Mia Farrow in it, as various other people. And it just has this beautiful otherworldliness about it. And this is something that Shakespeare seems to do for me anyway. It transports me into a magical realm. And because when I was doing my degree in history, I specialized in the Tudors and the early Stuarts. So it's a period of history I know quite well, but a period of history that also has its mysterious underpinnings. And of course, it was the period of the English Reformation. And of course, in the early years of Shakespeare's life, it was the James I coming down from Scotland. So there was this kind of different period from the Elizabethan period to the Jacobean period. And the way in which Shakespeare's plays changed. But also when I was at university, I was at the University of Warwick. And of course, we were just down the road from Stratford upon Avon. So, you know, the concept of the Forest of Arden being a symbol of the ancient feelings of ancient Britain, I think really imbued itself into the countryside. So this is why I'm particularly interested in this conversation. I'm by far not an expert on Shakespeare, whereas these two guys are absolute experts. So without further ado, I'd like the two of them to introduce them, but just very quickly as a bit of background, I met Alan around about 12, 13, 14 years ago when he gave me a very, very difficult time of it at Hoylake Library on the Wirral, when he asked some very, very difficult questions. And since then, we've become really, really close friends. And I would say of all my friends, Alan is my go-to when I need intellectual stimulation, I think, because he is such a profoundly deep thinker. And of course, Jake Murray. Jake and I have met once, and I met Jake through his wonderful father, Braham Murray, the theatre director. And Braham, we were just discussing before how much I miss Braham, and I can only say how much Jake must miss Braham because he was such a wonderful personality. And I'd also like to have been in a meeting with Braham and Alan, because I'm sure it would have been quite fascinating, the ideas that would have come round. Graham has been a guest on this previous program. Sadly, the recording wasn't as good as it should have been, but I still think it's a wonderful epitaph to a great career and a wonderful human being. So without further ado, Alan, if you can explain a little bit about yourself so people know who the mysterious Dr. Alan Roberts is.
Right. That's a very difficult thing to do, actually, because, of course, to me, there seems to be lots and lots of things, strands all coming together. I suppose it's my interest, speaking of theatre, which links the three of us here. My father was in amateur dramatics, and so I was brought up working class in Liverpool. But my dad, who was a radar technologist, mainly because the Navy during the war made him into a radar technologist. He did extremely well for himself, was also fascinated by amateur dramatics. And the first play I went to see, and he was stage manager in it, was Midsummer Night's Dream. And I think I must have been about 7, and it was completely magical and just took me out of my world completely. And I agree with you, Tony, completely. I think the play itself manages to distill that feeling of English summer, particularly English summer around about twilight, when it just seems to resonate with otherworldliness. You know, it feels like it's some different dimension. And we're getting it at the moment because we've had a bit of a heat wave here. And the evenings have been absolutely magical. And you can't sleep in the mornings because it's quite warm. So you get up early, you hear the dawn chorus, and again, you're into this wonderful, magical world. Heswell is pretty tree-ish, so there's plenty of little woods and things to go and visit. So yeah, I completely agree with that. And that's what the place sort of shook me with. And I would profess to be pretty knowledgeable about Midsummer Night's Dream, but the rest of Shakespeare, you know, he is so deep and there is so much going on with him. I love the plays. I mean, I believe, Jake, you're doing The Tempest.
No, it's Macbeth.
Macbeth, right?
Macbeth, and then another director is doing Midsummer Night's Dream with the same actors.
Oh, right, great. Well, Macbeth is the one scary play, and you know, particularly colleagues in the theatre won't even mention the name, as you know. So it's often called MacTavish or the Scottish play, and you know, or anything but that, or you know, the play that cannot be named. But so I went to primary school, grammar school. We did Shakespeare, and they did some marvelous productions of Shakespeare. Bill Kenwright was there. Actually, he was at the same school as me.
Did you go to Quarry Bank?
No, Institute.
Oh, right. Okay.
And Bill Kenwright was brilliant in A Servant of Two Masters. Fantastic play, Bill Goldoni. And again, totally fascinating to see it and be involved in the process. So then I went to Keele University, came out as a teacher. It was desperate days for teachers in the early 70s. So I was literally let free. The headmaster had to let me go because he couldn't afford to keep me. The birth rate dropped and there were just few kids. So all the grants and everything went down. And so I went and trained to become a carpenter. A good friend of mine ran the Everyman Cafe. And when I came out of the training, trained through the Dole offices, you know, he said, well, the Everyman's looking for a theatre carpenter. So I joined the Everyman and became not just a carpenter, but master carpenter overnight. So having had a 6 months training in carpentry, I became a master carpenter at the Everyman and stayed in theatre for the next 10 years, building plays and sets for TV, film, because I moved from the Everyman to the Playhouse, and the Playhouse had a vast workshop. And although I wasn't the master carpenter there, I was of a team of 3 or 4 carpenters usually, and great group of painters. And we did shows for Sight and Sound, the big Birmingham company, which used to run shows for Black Sabbath and Pink Floyd and stuff. So we've done bits and stuff for that, and lots of shows for London, etc. So very much involved in that. Plus we also put a play on downstairs and upstairs every 4 weeks. So we had to build a whole set and plays for 2 theatres, upstairs and downstairs at the Playhouse. So, and then literally from then I went back into teaching. Kept working for theatres at weekends and stuff and doing projects, and then decided that I wanted to do a PhD. So I did a PhD on Midsummer Night's Dream. So that would suggest that I'm sort of knowledgeable of it. And I was very lucky because while I was there, Jonathan Bate was there at Liverpool as well. So he's an absolute brilliant classicist. I mean, he traces Shakespeare right back to the roots. A man, you know, he's fluent, I think, in Latin. He read Ovid in Latin so that he knew where Shakespeare was following Ovid and where Shakespeare was following, you know, the translators of Ovid. So, you know, he could actually explain the bard sitting there, creating a scene and using probably a translation and the original, you know. So he stressed to me the fact that Shakespeare would have been brought up in the English grammar school tradition of about 1560, which was all Latin based. So they would recite and write and copy and translate and imitate the Greek writers, the Roman writers. And so Ovid would have been right there, center of his consciousness. So when he comes to write a play, he has all this background of myth and storytelling and also wonderful poetry. I mean, Midsummer Night's Dream, he would say, is based on Metamorphosis by Ovid, which is 15 books of all the myths that the Romans, you know, acknowledged came from Greece, etc., passionately sort of displayed in really good poetry. So Jonathan Bate sort of gave me that dimension, which I wouldn't have had without him. He left Liverpool pretty soon after that, but of course he's quite a popular figure now, so you probably heard him on the radio several times. A great mind, actually, and I was lucky enough to have several talks with him, and he actually read my thesis and made a comment on it. So that was a great feather in my cap. So from that, really, I retired from teaching, went into literally doing up houses and things, which I stopped doing about 5 or 6 years ago. So that's me, really. Met you and certainly enjoyed the conversations we've had and the groups that you've actually dragged me to and introduced me to. Fantastic stuff. Yeah. I have to say this because I mentioned this to Tony. I was very lucky to have met a wonderful man called Eugene Halliday, to which I dragged my father as well. And his philosophy has been the basis which led me through all of these things, including Shakespeare. And it was discussing him and Commedia dell'arte that actually made me choose to do Midsummer Night's Dream and to look at the character structure inside it. Because Commedia dell'arte, I fell immediately in love with as soon as I saw it. And so that's me. It's not hardly a nutshell, but excuse me, Jake, for rabbiting on so much.
No, that was wonderful, Alan. That was absolutely fascinating with things I was not aware of in terms of your background as well. So it's profoundly interesting. Okay, Jake, in terms of yourself, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, your influences and everything as well?
Yeah, my life's not nearly as interesting. So I grew, as you pointed out, Anthony, my father was a theatre director, my mother was a theatre designer. And that's how they got together. Fascinatingly and coincidentally, it was a production of Midsummer Night's Dream that they were working on, where they first actually came together. She was designing it, he was directing it, and there was a fizz, and they got together, and history was made, as it were. So I grew up with my brother, with Shakespeare very much part of the wallpaper of home, not just Shakespeare, but theatre in general. And it was I left and actually left home and went to university, and then went on to work in the theatre, that I realised how weird and unusual my upbringing was, because I was brought up. They helped found the Royal Exchange Theatre, which was based on international theatre. So you had Shakespeare, you had Marlowe, you had Greek tragedy, you had Ibsen, you had Strindberg, you had Chekhov, you had everything. Eugene O'Neill, Tennessee Williams, and it was a group of theatre directors, all of whom had areas of expertise. So two of the directors specialised in Strindberg, Ibsen, and Chekhov. Others, my father specialised in Shakespeare. That was his thing that he did most of all. So I grew up with all these theatre playwrights as household gods. It was like, pass the coffee. What are we having for dinner? Oh, are you working on Ibsen tonight? What do you think of Solness? Blah, blah, blah. So I grew up with my brother saturated in these plays and talking about them all the time with each other, just as a matter of course. And that went on as we grew up, my brother and I, and we still to this day go back and read the plays over and over again and talk about them and insights and things that we found. So many ways they've never been frightening to us. Do you know what I mean? Although when we were very young, they made no sense to us at all with Shakespeare. It was a production of As You Like It that we saw, which had Janet McTeer with Nicholas Hytner directed at the Royal Exchange, which was the key that for both of us unlocked Shakespeare. And as soon as you actually somehow are able to unlock it, and the language comes to life for you, so instead of it being this mysterious kind of alien language which you have to observe, ... pentameter, which always trips you up, as soon as you get into that and you break the surface of it and you swim around in it, it becomes this incredibly magical and mystical kind of experience. 30 years later, this is the 30th anniversary of me starting as a theatre director. I've only, in all that time, I've only been able to direct one professionally, which was Romeo and Juliet, which they did at the Royal Exchange, which had the very young Andrew Garfield in it, and the very straight out of drama school, the very young Gugu and Barta Raw playing Juliet, and an actor called Andy Buchan, who you will know on television. They were all straight out of drama school, and they're all doing their first work for me. And that's an indication a little bit. Actually, I was in my mid-30s. And in a week, I start rehearsals for Macbeth, which is part of the Durham Shakespeare Festival, which I'm launching with my company up here in Durham. And there's 15 years of a gap, almost 20 years actually, of a gap between those two productions. And that tells you a little bit about how Shakespeare's changed in terms of how he's done in this country. That when my father was young, by the age of 35, he had directed countless Shakespeares. Shakespeare was being done all over the country. All theatres were doing them. Now, most theatres can't afford to do them. The only companies that do them all the year round are the Globe and the RSC. Even big theatres like the Royal Exchange or the Leeds Playhouse no longer do them because they can't. So the tide is going out from this incredibly creative period after the Second World War, where Shakespeare was being done everywhere, to the point where it's very, very hard to get them on. So we're excited to be doing them. But over the years, there's always what you described, Anthony, about the otherworldly, the magical quality of Shakespeare. There is a transcendent quality to the material, which I was doing an interview the other day with a professor up here. Even 30 years on, when you're immersed in all the other playwrights of his time, whether it's Webster or Marlowe or Tunner or Ben Jonson, they're all fantastic playwrights. But there's something extra about Shakespeare, which goes further than all of them, which is why he's not just lasted for 400 years, but is also performed all over the world, and admired all over the world. There's an energy to it. There's something about the language, and there's something about his vision, which is almost unique. It doesn't, the kind of theatre he created, you don't see it in his contemporaries. There isn't an equivalent play to Midsummer Night's Dream in anybody else's work of his time. He invented the history play. I mean, he invented it. And although the tragedies, in some sense, imitate other tragedies, like Hamlet is like a revenge tragedy, it's still nothing like any of the other revenge tragedies. So, and then he created another genre at the end, which was the romances, those late plays, like, as you mentioned, The Tempest, which is one of after the Midsummer Night's Dream, probably his most overtly magical play. So the question is how and why, and what was going on. And I've always been interested in mysticism and the esoteric. I tend to avoid the word occult because it has such dark connotations, but actually esoteric and occult mean the same thing. And the older I've got and the more I've looked into classical philosophy, Neoplatonism, alchemy, Christian mysticism, the more I see that in the writing and the myths. And Ovid is a massive, all the way through his work. What was it that captured his imagination, and how he, as you say, took other people's material but reforged it in a way that was dramatic and still had this extraordinary punch, which means you could watch the plays and not know about any of it, but still be taken off into other worlds of the imagination. Does that make sense? So those are the things that interest me. Midsummer Night's Dream is an extraordinary play. I mean, there's loads. It's a bottomless pit in terms of the discussion, and I'm certainly still discovering stuff. So I'll stop there and over to you, Anthony.
It's quite interesting, isn't it, here, in the sense that the associations I'm making here with certain things, and there's two associations I would like to make, in that I remember way back, probably 1970, 71, maybe later, maybe slightly later, going to an incredible performance of Richard III at the Everyman Theatre in Liverpool with Jonathan Pryce. And I remember the opening sequence. They did it, maybe Alan will remember this, they actually did it like a circus. And it was in the round, and Jonathan Pryce comes on and he opens up with, "This is the winter of our discontenta." And it stunned me because it made me realize how Shakespeare is for all time. You know, he's dealing with real human things, you know, and I like your point about it's dissimilar to the other Revenger tragedies. And I remember the Revenger tragedy, I can't remember who wrote it now, but I remember going to see that and being profoundly disappointed because the language didn't quite work in some way. And I don't know why it is. Shakespeare flows more. That was one of the things. And funnily enough, I saw a film production of the Revenger's tragedy by a school friend of mine from Wirral Grammar, a guy called Alex Cox, that maybe some of you will know from the movie Repo Man, and also Sid and Nancy. And he did a very interesting variation on that, which I thought was very good. And also, I was also reminded, of course, Jake, your father directed Mia Farrow, didn't he? Together with Andre Previn, I think, who possibly did the music when they did a performance of Audrey Rose.
Mary Rose.
Many years ago. So there's all these kind of, and of course, Mia Farrow was the central character of Ariel in the Woody Allen film Midsummer Night's Sex Comedy. So we have these wheels within wheels and circles within circles. But what I'd like to do now is to explore a little bit more about Shakespeare and his influences. We've touched upon Ovid. So what other things do you think, how did he become a playwright? You know, there is an obscure kid in Stratford-upon-Avon, you know, which is a provincial town in Warwickshire. You know, there was no, obviously Stratford-upon-Avon now is famous because of Shakespeare. It reminds me actually of a funny line. I was watching Kunk on television where she's going around Stratford-upon-Avon, and she turns around and she goes, "This is the school that Shakespeare went to. Of course, he had an easier time than most of us have had because he didn't have to study Shakespeare." And I thought, quite an interesting line that. But what do you think were his influences? So, Alan, if you'd like to start just a little bit, and then maybe the two of you can bounce off each other in terms of conversations about this.
Right. Well, we were talking about authenticity and literally nailing things down. It's very, very difficult with Shakespeare. Most of what I'll be saying is opinion, and it sort of flies in the face of sort of factual historical things, but you find embedded in the plays a vast knowledge of mythology, and I would suggest it's even deeper than that, because he seems to understand. Well, if we take Midsummer Night's Dream, for instance, you've got a wonderful layout which, when I was studying it, seemed to be talking directly along Jungian lines. You've got Athens, which is logical, clear, masculine, law-governed, and didactic. And you've got the forest, which is twilight, moonlit, sort of, it's not it's not dark, it's moonlit, it's twilight, and there are all these creatures which are neither one thing nor the other. And when the people from the town go into the forest, all sorts of magic starts to happen. And you've got this really rigid problem. You know, Hermia is actually fancies not the chap that her father wanted to marry. So you've got a sort of straightforward logical problem, a legal thing, and she's offered 3 solutions. She can become a nun, she can marry the man her father decides, or she can she can die. The authority is that rigid. And when they go off into the forest for various reasons, everybody goes into the forests and they get changed and mixed about. And there's lots of confusion, but it comes out at the end so that Hippolyta sort of says, well, the wonderful thing is, by some strange constancy, these things have all magically been sorted out. And to me, it's Jung talking about the conscious city and the unconscious forest, and nature is there, which is quite capable, if you can relax, to mix and match and sort and bend and twist things so that they all weave together. And that sort of happened to me while I was studying the play. So, and then I had to sort of really go into Jung, and literally the people who'd spoken like that. And you found that Shakespeare was probably, because with Midsummer Night's Dream, he's got it in a Greek flavor. It starts in Athens, but when you go into the folklore part of the forest, when they tow into the forest, you're certainly in England. You're, as you said, in the Forest of Arden. And these people are local guys. There's carpenters and shepherds and things and printmakers. So these are people literally mechanicals with their trades and stuff that the people Shakespeare would have grown up alongside. And they have the same myths and stories given local names because it's a fertility rite, as they have, as Theseus has in Greece. So it's like he's saying, look, this thing is a universal. It's everywhere, and here it's comical and it's clunky and it's sexy and it's wild, and here it's rigid and formalized, but it's still sexy and wild if you look underneath. And I mean, there's one magical part. There's a guy called Gaster. I forget when he was writing now, and I was reading him, and I found him sort of exciting and different, but he never sort of came down to earth, so to speak, and it all seemed to be supposition. And then he knocked me for 6 because he says, now there's a point at the very beginning of the play where Hippolyta talks about her new forged bow, and it's like the moon, and Titania echoes this. And Gaster says, well, this is surely a reference to Orion, the hunting god. And he dies. I mean, literally, the constellation falls out of the sky in the Northern Hemisphere. I think it's at the end of April. So it's just before May. And May starts, carries on, and the constellation comes back again at about the end of June. So for those 2 months, it's missing. And Gaster says, this is the period of midsummer madness. Now, those are the 2 dates that are mentioned in the play, May the 1st and Midsummer's Day. So you've got 1.5 months between those, in which the play the time scale in the play is really foggy and misty. You can't nail it down. She says, so 4 days and nights before we're married and the nuptials start. But it seems to be a very, very elastic. But Gaster says, so is Shakespeare writing about the fact that this is Orion disappearing? So order is relaxed completely. The forest and the summer take over, and everybody loosens their clothes, gets out, enjoys, drinks a bit more than they normally would, and there's no order again, and that starts to come back in again just as July turns into August. And so you suddenly think, well, good God, it's in the play. Is it deliberately in the play? Or is it just a poetic allusion to somebody who knows his myths backwards? But it's when you find it, you just find that tantalizing grip of, is there a lot more to this man than we think? and this ties in with the Hermetic tradition and the things that Francis Yates says. I think they're beautiful. I wonderful stuff. They aren't sort of nailed down enough for me, but who cares? The extension she gives to the playwright and to the play is magnificent.
Can you very quickly just reference the title of the Francis Yates book, please?
Of the what, sorry?
The Francis Yates book.
Oh, the God.
It doesn't matter if you can't remember. It's just that some people might be interested in checking it out because
I think
on
it's Shakespeare,
your
the
advice, I
Hermetic
read it.
tradition. I think I've got it here, Tony.
There's 2 or 3.
Yeah.
Okay, Jake, come in on. Please come in on this.
Well, it's really interesting. I mean, so I think what's right, your reference to Francis Yates is interesting. I think there's the occult tradition in the Elizabethan age is one of them, and there's also Theatre Through the Ages, which is an absolutely fascinating book, and Giordano. And well, that's fascinating because it talks about the design of the theatre, Shakespeare's theatres, and what the philosophy behind it was, which absolutely corresponds. Well, that's this and this. I think the big thing about talking about the occult or the esoteric or the mystical in the context of Shakespeare is you can make yourself sound ridiculous. Because you can start finding patterns everywhere. Do you know what I mean? Well, the fact that character is wearing a red hat is symbolic of blah blah blah. But I think the other book is the Giordano Bruno and the Hermetic tradition. I think something like that.
Yeah.
So what's interesting about her, and I think this is really important, is that when you mentioned Anthony about the influences, what we've got to remember is that Elizabethan England, Renaissance England, in fact, Renaissance Europe was pre-industrial. It was pre-Enlightenment, pre-rational, pre-Newton. So it was all pre the idea that everything was a mechanism and it was all very materialist and everything was rational, and all sorts of ideas which we now think of as weird and occulty and very un-Richard Dawkins were very much the intellectual landscape of the time. And what Francis Yates identifies is that the trigger of the Renaissance, which was very different to the Enlightenment, was 2 catastrophes, one that happened in Spain, and one catastrophe depending on your point of view, and one that happened in Constantinople, the fall of Constantinople on the one hand, and the expulsion of the Jews from Spain on the other, went by the Catholic Church after the reconquest of Spain, where it was taken back from the Muslim, the different dynasties of Islam that ran it, and the Jews were expelled. And at the same time, Constantinople fell to the Turks, and the Greeks fled across, and the hub of it was Italy. Mm-hmm. And what happened was that the Jews brought the Talmud, Maimonides, and the Kabbalah, the Zohar, all of these different things, and the Greeks brought Plato, Aristotle, Neoplatonism, Plotinus, and particularly the Hermetica, which you mentioned, Alan. And all this sudden new knowledge, which Italy hadn't known of before, suddenly exploded, and the Catholic Church embraced it. They didn't suppress it; they embraced it because it seemed to confirm Christian doctrine. And out of this came the Italian Renaissance, and it started with Pico de Mirandola, a very famous young man in the early 20s, his famous articles and a particular speech called The Oration on the Dignity of Man, which you get referenced in Hamlet.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, and he studied, it was a man called Ficino who inspired him. There's a lot of stuff here. And he references Kabbalah, the Hermetica, Neoplatonism. There was also Sufism. I mean, there was a huge ferment, and this triggered the Florentine Renaissance. Michelangelo was aware of it. Vitruvius, the great Latin architect who laid down the foundations of sacred architecture in ancient temples. And this exploded through Italy, in Venice and Florence in particular, which then pollinated France and came to England very late. And it came to us after Henry VIII, around Henry VIII, but it exploded in the Elizabethan era. So London at the time was awash with people studying alchemy and astrology and all of these different things, but they weren't seen as crackpot. They were like us reading Foucault or Baudrillard or Nietzsche now. Do you see what I mean?
Absolutely, yeah, I completely agree. And it was a little bit later, and of course, our noblemen were not quite so refined as they were in Italy and France. They were still agriculturalists. In fact, most of them were still farmers. So at the court would be a bit more rough and ready than it would have been in Italy or Florence. So they were more down to earth, and I think that's maybe why it wasn't such an artistic. It was more of speech and of writing and poetry than it was of visuals. But I completely agree.
The big thing is that what was also happening was there was before Shakespeare's theatre was religious, it was morality plays, etc., etc., and there was an injunction on that. I think at a certain point there were all sorts of blasphemy laws to do with the Reformation, and the theatre became secular, and also it was pushed out of the city. So all of these theatres that Shakespeare performed in were in Southwark on mudflats outside London. So to get to them, you had to walk through mud and filth. And so there was this, and this is the big thing, is that they were equivalent of cinema, going to cinema.
Yeah.
And as you pointed out, Alan, the majority of the audience were working class, unlettered people, like the mechanicals.
You've got the 3-level tier, haven't you? You've got the floor where the people stood, and it was on hazelnut shells because they used to piddle and everything else when they were down there, because they couldn't get out. They were trapped in there for 3 hours, And then you've got the merchant class, and then above that you've got the nobles. I mean, it was really quite stratified and completely represented the society. And it processed so many people. I mean, I think, you can get the thing about the Globe is it's a wonderful machine for showing plays, because everybody is really quite close to the action. You've got almost over 1,000 people easy within 40 foot of the stage. And, these people are literally right in front of you, going through the throes of their ploy. Have you been to the new Globe?
I have, yeah.
It's wonderful.
That gives you
so right.
Yeah. But
we were there in a rainstorm actually, and it's actually thatched, so it absorbs the rain for about an hour, and then it becomes like a sheet, and it just comes right down the back of your neck. We were in the hoi polloi, in the pit, so we got absolutely soaked, and we bought one of these £1 Pack-a-Mac things, so we all looked like pork sausages. But actually, it was still fantastic, because what you notice is the audience follows the play. If an actor comes down to the front, everybody comes round. It's like he can put his arm around, and you can whisper. It's fabulous.
Well, that's the thing, is the idea that Shakespeare is an elitist playwright is absolutely not the case. That he was fundamentally writing for ordinary people, but he was paid for by the box office, but also by, and this is the other interesting thing, by the monarch, because under Elizabeth it was the Lord Chamberlain's men, so he'd have known Elizabeth, and he would have been in the court. He would have met ambassadors and noblemen, and under King James, it was the King's men, because James was a massive fan of theatre and immediately sponsored. So Shakespeare would have had access to all the intellectual world. And
sorry, just take up on that, because that's one of the things which strikes me, that Shakespeare wrote Shakespeare, so to speak, because in the coronation actual parade, Shakespeare has his uniform is actually paid for by King James. He is actually dressed by the king, and Eden Ravenscroft still have got the bills that was paid, and we know that he was dressed in red velvet. So yes, excuse me.
That's the interesting thing, because if there was one thing I wanted to focus on in this conversation, it's the history plays, because the use of Shakespeare that Prince Charles put into that was very, very deliberate, and in fact I hadn't actually obviously none of us had seen a coronation, because the last time was in 1953, and it was very interesting. The only part of it I watched was the actual ritual of the coronation itself. I'm neither a monarchist nor a Republican, but I did find myself wanting to watch that, because we don't know when that will come round, and I'll come to it later. But watching the actual process of the coronation, everything about the history plays clicked into place, and all the different influences that we're talking about. If there was one thing I had time to, that's what I'd like to talk about. But the last thing I'd just like to say, Anthony, is just to finish up, and obviously, Adam, you and I have read these books. What Francis Yates makes is a very, very plausible case, as far as I'm concerned, that where Shakespeare's access to books came, because one of the big reasons why people believe that people like Francis Bacon or Oxford de Vere were the authors was that even though Shakespeare was grammar school, he wouldn't have had the wide range of knowledge that he clearly had. And he was obviously a voracious reader, because, as you say, Alan, he obviously read all of Ovid, who was massive for him. But you see, every play is inspired by something else, and full of references to other things. And I remember somebody saying it can't have been Shakespeare, it had to have been Francis Bacon, because where did he have his library? Where did Shakespeare get his books from? So this is where it gets controversial, but I think there's something to this, is that Francis Yates makes the case that the intellectual energy of the Elizabethan era came from Dr. John Dee, who was we know this is a matter of historical record, who was officially Queen Elizabeth's court astrologer, and we know that he is alleged to have calculated the optimum day for her coronation, and also the day when we should fight the Armada.
Yeah.
But he also claimed to speak with angels and all this kind of stuff. But he had a repository, he had the biggest library in England outside Oxford.
Which he invited people to. Yeah.
Exactly. And he was at the center of the literary circle that included people like Philip Sidney, George Chapman, Edmund Spenser, and he was educating them and making them read his stuff, because he believed that part of the mission of a great England, which would rival Rome and Greece, was a great literature.
Yeah.
And so he was actually not just part of the political life of Elizabethan England, he was part of its literary life. And I'm almost certain
you call him the architect of the British Empire, John Dee.
Yeah, but if there was anywhere who could have switched Shakespeare on to ideas and reading and all those things, and also he was what was known in the day as a magus, so he knew his alchemy, he knew his Kabbalah. He was the first person to learn Hebrew in England. He taught himself Hebrew so he could read the Old Testament and the Kabbalah. He traveled in Europe. He met famous alchemists. And it's my belief, including Ovid, that's where Shakespeare got his sources from. And that the archetype, you mentioned Jung, the power of mystical ideas is they're archetypal. They follow the profound processes of human life and the psyche, and that Shakespeare was excited by that and tapped into it with his imagery and his stagecraft. And that's one of the reasons why the plays still have such a powerful energy.
Can I just jump in here just to get the chronology right? So effectively what Shakespeare was born in 1564, and John Dee would have been around about the 1680s, 1690s. So he was a comparatively young man, I guess, at the time when he met Dee. He would have been young. Yeah.
Yeah.
Shakespeare was a very young man. Yeah, I think he was in his 20s or 30s when he wrote his first plays. He wasn't an old man, I don't think.
And you can notice the difference in his plays. They become slightly, or to me, more harsher in a sense after the Elizabethan period. I mean, she died in 1603, I think, and James took to the throne then. And of course, it was then a different court. The whole attitude towards the occult, or I tend to want to call it the supernatural, because the occult does have those sort of shady things, and Shakespeare does use it in both ways. I mentioned Eugene Halliday, the chap that taught me, and one of his books is he considered to be that Shakespeare was the king educator, was reminding the king of literally where his authority came and why it was a symbol that he had to live through. You know, the Sun Kings, the whole imagery of that, which you could. I was taking a course at Tannigarth on the day of the coronation. And everybody in the room sort of agreed to stop and watch the actual coronation ceremony. And we were moved by it. And I think there were moments when Charles himself seemed to be very shaken by the things he was being asked to do. It was difficult, you know, and the symbolism, you know, of Penny Mordaunt standing there holding the sword, the whole sort of references was incredibly sort of meaningful and potent.
Yeah, well, they go back to, this is the thing, is I absolutely agree, and this is the thing, is if you watch what the whole ritual was, it's because we're not really a monarchist country anymore in the way that we were. When Shakespeare was at the heart of the history plays is that ceremony. That's the ceremony that you never see in the history plays, but actually it's enacted in every single play. It's a very, very holy rite.
Yeah.
The idea is that the whole symbolism of him being stripped to a white tunic where he's just nothing there, and then they put the screens up because that's the anointing, and then when he emerges, he's someone else. He's a king. He's no longer the earthly man. He's become something else. The connection with Christ, the idea that the monarch is actually supposed to cease to have an ego, and is supposed to symbolize, he's God's anointed. That he's supposed to serve the people. And the thing of the whole ritual is it's the ancient alchemical ritual, which you see in Christian mysticism. You see it in the Bible, of the death and rebirth. The old ego dies, the new is born, and all the way through the history plays, that is the enactment of the same thing. The imagery, as you say, of the sun, the dying sun, the rising sun, the endless references.
The crown, the sun represented in the crown, and him actually subtended from that sort of solar,
yes,
so to speak.
Well, yes, exactly. Well, you have the crown chakra. You have the highest sephirot in Kabbalah is the crown. The idea that once the king has made their sacred vows, they're a kind of circuit between the divine and the earthly. And the point in the plays is that the kings that fail are the ones who break the circuit. That Richard doesn't live up to his vows and is brought down. But interestingly, becomes a hermit. If you look at his speech, where he says, I will take off my crown and I will wear a skull cap. I will remove this and I will just wear a hermit's. And then Henry never succeeds because he's already betrayed the vow by usurping. But he dies in the Jerusalem room, and then Henry is the one who ends up serving. But he has to go through his own death and rebirth before the Battle of Agincourt. And as you say, the sun rises on the battle. So underneath it all, prior to this, I went off and read all the plays again, just to see if I wasn't making it up. And the imagery is all the way through, of the sun, the alchemical imagery of Hal starts as Hal he's cheap in the pub, and that's the kind of prime matter, and then gradually gradually he has to reject it. He has to cut off full stuff, the earthly self, and then he ceases to be Hal and he becomes Harry. Do you see? And the changing name, so the Prince Charles dies and King Charles comes out, and the idea of the symbolism of the orb and the scepter, it's all the cosmic symbolism that goes all the way back to Christianity, to what came before Christianity, and there it is in the plays. And and that's what I think gives it its charge, is that Shakespeare was writing this incredible drama, a brilliant political story full of battles, intrigue, comedy, but at the same time it's this amazing progress of the soul. Does that make sense?
I'll try and get you a copy of Halliday's Shakespeare King Educator, because he actually puts it that Shakespeare is constantly reminding him of the king of this, and of course we know that the kings did visit the plays. So I mean, So
it's intriguing, isn't it, here how the Shakespeare was writing for the common man in many ways, and we were saying about how the hoi polloi were down there in the pit and they would follow the play and cheer and everything else. But there's all this incredibly esoteric writing that's very much symbolic. Would you believe that the general audience in that world would understand the symbolism? And if they didn't, who was he writing the symbolism for? Who was his target audience for that?
Well, I don't think. Do you mind if can I jump in there?
Yeah, no, please.
I think the power of the symbolism is that you don't need to understand it for it to move you. If you only spot it intellectually, then it isn't doing any work on you. The point is, as you say, Alan, the Jungian point is that archetypes work on you without you knowing. So the moment in Henry IV Part 2, where Prince Hal goes into the Jerusalem room and King Henry is lying sick on his bed and he's asleep, which is a very alchemical image of the old king and the prince, and he thinks that his father's died. and he picks up the crown and he puts it on and he leaves the room, and then Henry wakes up and goes, "Oh my God, where's my crown? What's happened?" And they all start panicking, and in comes Henry and he's Hal, and he's wearing, and he goes, "Oh my God, ha, you've caught me with the crown." And then when he wears it properly and comes out and says, "I am no longer Harry, I'm no longer Hal, I'm Harry, I'm Harry." That's the genius of it, is that you don't need to understand. They're going, "Oh well, yes, this is a reference to the Sephiroth Cater, which is a crown." You go, "My God," you can see it through the symbolism and the resonance of that symbolism. It just happens. Do you know what I mean? And I think at the end of Midsummer Night's Dream, whether Titania and Oberon come on as the god and the goddess, or her and the hunter and whatever, the May Queen, you don't need to know that to recognize there's a huge power to them appearing if you do it properly. That's
true, but we do get the beauty. We get also, particularly at the end of Midsummer Night's Dream, the thing which I would like to point out, that Shakespeare is also saying, particularly in this play, and again deliberately at the end, that we are, such stuff as dreams are made of. We are literally forms in consciousness, and we go back into the consciousness that we came out of. At the end of that, he's resolving this. It's only been a dream. If you've been disturbed by anything you've seen, it's only a dream. We'll mend it for you. We'll reprehend. We'll do all the things we need to. You can go back to sleep now if you want to, and we'll leave you. And it's a very gentle sort of letting you down again as they sort of back away. So, if you like, the occult things have been in, moving the whole scene about, solving the problems, putting everything back together, sort of backing away from Theseus and all his kingdom. He's going to have his nuptials. He's literally part of this whole sort of fertility rhythm, and we'll just back away and let you think that you've got everything under control again, and we'll go back into the no thing that we came out of. It's a wonderful, blissful, now we'll let you human beings get on with what we've just sorted out for you again. And I think Shakespeare does that beautifully.
Didn't Jake, your father's very last book, I'm just reminded of now, didn't he take a speech from Shakespeare in that book?
That was actually my idea.
It was brilliant. It was brilliant.
It's quite a funny story. He was going to write an autobiographical book, and I said, "I don't think you should." Because the first book he'd written had upset quite a lot of people.
But it was wonderful. But it was still wonderful.
No, I know. So I said, I'm not sure that's a clever idea. Why don't you write about your wisdom about Shakespeare and share that with everybody? And he said, "Great idea." And I said, "Yes, so as you discuss the plays, then share your wisdom." And I said, "I think," and then he went off and he took All the World's a Stage. Mm-hmm. And he used that as a way of a framework of describing different aspects of life. So the last section was dealing with old age. But I think Alan, you put your finger on so much powerful stuff there, because the plays are very often about what's real and what's not. And the point in The Dream, when I directed it a few years ago with students, I was very struck by the way that the play presents dreams on top of dreams. Characters fall asleep and you don't know whether what's happening next is happening, or whether it's the dream and Titania's dream, or whether it's Bottom's dream. And then when Bottom wakes up, I had the most incredible dream. And at one point, Titania promises to turn him into pure spirit, which is fascinating. Yeah. And everything you just said that Puck says, he says, it's all just a dream, else the Puck a liar call. And we already know that Puck's a liar. But you mentioned we are such stuff as dreams are made on, which of course is from The Tempest. And that's his last play. And that's the last that's the great Satori moment.
It's not at the end of the play, it's nearly at the end of the play.
That's what suddenly he has this moment where nothing is, it's as you say.
Can I read it? Because I've got it here. And I did a talk a couple of months ago about literally the field, the Akashic field, and how, because I think, when he's talking about a man plays many parts, that literally we are literally playing parts all the way through our life. We're, in the end we melt back into it. And I've got it here. I've got it right. This is my notes literally from the talk, and the last thing which I wanted to read, which is there, is literally the speech, and it gives us so much more, because I think it's talking purely about consciousness. Be cheerful, sir. Our revels now are ended. These are actors, as I foretold you, were all spirits, and are melted into air, into thin air. And like the baseless fabric of this vision, the cloud-capped towers, the gorgeous palaces, the solemn temples, the great globe itself, yea, all which it inherit, shall dissolve. And like this great insubstantial pageant faded, leave not a rack behind. We are such stuff as dreams are made on, and our little life is rounded with a sleep.
Yeah, it's beautiful. Absolutely.
It is magnificent.
But the interesting thing there again is because these are debates that people are having now about science and panpsychism and dualism and eliminative materialism. Is there such a thing as consciousness? Are quantum processes defined by consciousness? The whole idealist idea that everything is consciousness, etc., etc. These and people who argue that these things are real are laughed at. But we forget that when Shakespeare was writing, these were ideas that were current everywhere in Neoplatonism, in not even in, strange stuff like Kabbalah and Hermeticism. You find it in Augustine, you find it in Christian mysticism.
You find it in Kant. You find it in Kant as well. I mean, it's magnificent stuff. And I mean, if we take consciousness as literally the experiencer, there is nothing as real as the experience. There's nothing else but experience that we are. I mean, all these ideas, even materialism, is based as the experience that we get through our senses. What's on the other side of our senses, we don't know, because what comes through to us is, light, color, all the things which we are conscious to us, but that's not what, is measurable out there. So I would say consciousness is everything to this.
Well, that's the point, is that I'm about to start rehearsing Macbeth, which is a play I've studied and seen a billion times most of my life. But what strikes me when I'm working on it at the moment is just how interior the play is, that a vast swathe of it is Macbeth swimming around in his own mind.
Yes.
Do you know what I mean? And that's actually a feature of, this is a really interesting, Shakespeare was the first playwright to put the interior life on stage. That the whole, although Marlowe has soliloquies, they're not interior, they're more kind of, what Shakespeare created was on stage a world of external reality where characters operate with each other, and then this world of internal reality, which is the soliloquies, where characters discuss and describe what's happening to them inside. Do you know what I mean?
Yes.
And he was first playwright, and he also showed how a man, particularly men, can get ensnared in that interior dialogue and become paralyzed by it and confused and lost, but also inspired. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And he was, and I think this is the interesting thing. If you take the soliloquies out of Hamlet, or you take them out of Macbeth, or you take them out of Iago, you lose half the play. Do you know what I mean? Equally, it's because we as the audience are privy to the soliloquies, we forget that none of the other characters are.
Yep.
Do you know what I mean? So like because we at length know what's going on in Hamlet's mind, we forget that Horatio doesn't know what he's thinking, that Ophelia doesn't know why he's doing what he's doing. We forget that because we know, we've been watching Iago plotting, we think, a lot of people think, well, Othello's obviously a fool, can he not see it? And of course he can't see it, because he's not watching the play. You know what I mean? So
I agree. I think it's wonderfully true.
But I think this thing of the psyche, Shakespeare, and the mind and the psyche and the consciousness, talking to my actor playing Macbeth, he said it feels like there are all these different Macbeths all in his head, and they're all arguing with each other. And I think that's the point is that Shakespeare was the first man to truly understand just what a complex thing the interior consciousness was.
Well, I would say I completely agree with that, but to me, it seems that we could also say and I think it's a valid point, that Shakespeare uses the supernatural to give us more of that dimension in time. Certainly in Hamlet, although I would say, like, he invented the detective story, I think, in Hamlet, because, Hamlet gets the message. His father comes in, and the other people see the ghost as well. In most of Shakespeare's ghosts, only the protagonist sees the ghost. But actually, in Hamlet, the other soldiers on the battlements see the ghost as well. So we know he's got this thing, and then he interrogates it. He forces it through certain sieves to see whether or not he can act upon this, which in the end, of course, he does. So, but we could also say that Shakespeare's using the supernatural to give us an extra dimension. He does that in Othello. He does that in, I would say, certainly in Julius Caesar.
Yes.
So we can see this extra mirror, which gives us more of the ideas which are influencing him.
Also,
it is a device as well, like the soliloquy. It's a device for getting inside protagonists' heads.
And also to extend the emotional power of what's going on in their heads.
Yeah.
It's interesting, but again, to debunk the idea that all this is woo-woo, if you look at the golden age of recent kind of epic cinema, you watch Raiders of the Lost Ark. Part of the reason why Raiders of the Lost Ark is so epic is it combines the real world of Nazis and the Second World War and all that with the Ark of the Covenant, the idea of God, the idea of avenging angels, or in Star Wars, if you took the Force, I'm talking about the first three films, which still had the mystery. If you take the Force out of the Jedi out of the first three films, it's very ordinary. It's just ordinary sci-fi, but it's that weird.
Dead. I would say it's dead. Yeah.
Yes, which he consciously took from Joseph Campbell, who consciously was inspired by Jung. And the other one is Close Encounters, where if you look at the way when the final starship appears over Devil's Mountain, that is deliberately supposed to echo God's appearance on Mount Sinai. If you look at the way the clouds gather, that's a volcano. What I mean? Lights are taking off into cosmic whatevers. Or I recently watched E.T. And if you watch E.T. now, I don't know when you last saw it, it's full of references to fairy tales, goblins and gnomes, and it's filmed in such a way so that you're deliberately plugging into stuff. Or even hilariously, Bod. Do you remember Bod? The Here Comes Bod children's program? I don't, I'm afraid. It was a 70s children program that I grew up with, and Bod was this little man with a bald head and a yellow triangular body. And many years later, it turned out that the reason why he was a little man with a bald head was that the creators of it was a children's program, were steeped in Buddhism and Taoism. Right. So actually, these little children's programs are full of little, like the Tao of Pooh, full of kind of mystical ideas conveyed in. So the reason he's yellow is because he's a Buddhist monk. so people have been doing this forever. Do you know what I mean? Well, if our minds are literally, if we are part of this Akashic field, this field of being and awareness, then these stories, the glamour which we see about the supernatural, will be the resonances that we're feeling, that stories have edges which disappear into the no-thing. And so, to me, the more references that has, the hierarchies that you see in display, actually fascinates people who are not of this particular mind, but still know the hierarchy because it's internalized. Yes. You talk about the Sephirah, it's the same as the chakras. So you could actually, you have the hierarchy built into, and you can hear it resonating, feel it resonating. Shakespeare puts everybody, he has characters called Pompey Bum and Bottom. Yes. He doesn't forget the fact that we have, we aren't just all cranium. We've got a heart particularly, and we've got gonads as well, and they're written into the plays. The people are represented in those things. In Midsummer Night's Dream, for God's sake, he puts the Queen of Fairies in bed with a donkey. What more obscene can you imagine about that? Jan Kott goes on about that. Amazing thing to do. He could have lost his head. He could have been shortened by at least 9 inches for saying something like that. But he does it beautifully, and it's comical.
and he gets away with it. You know, we're fairly sure Queen Elizabeth saw the play. So, you know, he gets away with it because he puts it in a hierarchical structure that resonates within human beings, you know. And I mean, I think, you know, if we go off into people like Barfield and Gebser, we're talking about consciousness evolving, then here is one of the great evolvers of consciousness. He raised so many people with those stories. Literally, the thousands of people that saw them at the Globe, and how many people have discussed them now. It's a great shame. I didn't. You put a very sharp point on it when you were saying we can't afford to do them all. Is that because the casts are so big?
Yes.
Yeah.
The
costume, etc. Yeah.
Put on a Shakespeare.
A great shame. A great shame.
I mean, also most theatres across the country, this is the problem, is with my company, doing the Shakespeare Festival is a hugely bold move. 13 actors is a lot of performers.
Yeah.
Most of our shows, I think, have 2 actors or 3. Some of them have had 5, one of them had 6. Most companies simply can't afford to present large cast plays, and the tragedy is that the majority of great theatre writing from pre-1956 all the way back are big casts. You know, Chekhov, you've got Sophocles, you've got Molière, you've got Shakespeare. Do you know what I mean? And there's a strangling going on of theatre in this country.
Yeah.
And it's heartbreaking, you know.
Yes.
But the interesting thing is that Shakespeare, and there's also within, this is a contentious comment, there is a very anti-Shakespeare spirit at the moment in the arts, which accuses him of being, you know, imperialist, colonialist, a white supremacist, male, racist, homophobic, anti-Semitic, etc., and that really we shouldn't be doing them, or if we do, we completely reboot them.
Yeah.
Which is part of a longer argument, which I don't agree with that argument anyway, but it's a bigger argument than you can have here. But it means that fundamentally, it means that the vast amount of the population aren't being allowed to make up their own mind.
That's right. Yeah.
And what we're seeing is that, and you know, at the moment, you've got, after COVID, when the theatres are trying to rev up again, we have Kenneth Branagh doing King Lear. We've got Joseph Fiennes about to do Macbeth in Liverpool. We've got, you know, and we're trying to do Shakespeare's up here. There's still a hunger for the work.
Oh yes. Yeah.
He still exists in our psyches, you know. And I would say, I often compare Shakespeare to the Beatles in that you can't actually imagine the world without them.
That's true. The other wonderful thing about him, and I would agree with all those criticisms you made about it from the modern theatre critics, because he's all those things and he's more, because he puts those opinions and he balances them with other opinions inside the play. And the beauty of Shakespeare, he doesn't comment outside of the plays. You know, we've got playwrights constantly talking about their stuff. He never does that. All his goodies are in the play, and if you can't find it there, then he doesn't take any time to sort of stress what he's trying to do.
He also, amazingly, doesn't seem to have been interested in them surviving, because when he died, none of them were published under his aegis, and they were, you know, so this year is the 400th anniversary of the first folio. I was quite shocked to discover that the folio was put together by some of his actors who were, you know, much older, and also some of the playwright friends that were great friends of his.
Yes.
And the reason,
just to get that right, so the first folio was put together in 1623 then?
Yeah.
Wow. I just didn't know that.
A long time, a significant amount of time after he died.
He died at 1616, didn't he? So that's
so he made no effort to publish the books. But what's really interesting is, had the folio not been put together, there's something like 36 plays. I only discovered this now because we're working closely with the university on it, because they have a copy, is that 13 of the plays would have been lost. Among those plays would have been Macbeth.
Yeah.
Wouldn't have survived. So if those actors and those playwrights hadn't put the money together to print them in a folio, we would have lost a huge swathe of his work. And the reason they did it was because there were all sorts of pirated versions floating around. bad versions, rewritten versions, or like an actor who'd done one of his plays would have sold his lines to someone. So the actor playing Polonius, so you'd have a version of Hamlet where it's all a bit hazy except for Polonius speaking. So and people were rewriting them and messing them about, and it was decided that no, this has got to stop. We need an authorized version, and that's where the folio came from, rather like the Gospels being written. It was like, everyone's making stuff up. Stop it. This is what he said.
And we're trying to steal it. Yeah.
And then they wrote, there's a second folio and a third folio as people went, hang on, we found this. So so that's the weird thing, is he created these pieces of theatre, but they were meant to literally evaporate after they had been performed.
He let them look after themselves. I mean, one of the things just before we started, I sat down and I worked out that he's got 37 plays, I think, if you count any of the 8th as well, which he did in conjunction, of course, and over a period of about 22 years. So I reckon he's knocking out about 1 3/4 plays a year. And most of those, you could say there's a good 12 of those plays that are still performed regularly all over the world.
And
in communist countries and in capitalist countries.
If he'd only written one of those 12 plays, he'd still be regarded as a great playwright. If he handed in King Lear, everyone would have gone, who was this guy? But there's something astonishing about the idea that if we brought him back now as the time machine and said, William, it's great to meet you, and he'd go, what? And you say, you're being performed all over the world. There's a Royal Shakespeare Theatre. We have a theatre. He'd go, what are you talking about? How did you, why? Because he had no idea that the plays would last after him, which is amazing.
Well, they knocked down Big House, the new place in Stratford, didn't they? They didn't think he was that important, and so he retired literally to the countryside, but got himself a big house and relaxed.
Yeah,
he'd made it, so to speak. Yeah.
It's an interesting point here. You really got me thinking about this. So effectively, when the plays were written by Shakespeare, would he have then amended them, or would they, from the first performance, would there be no changes put in, or as he saw the performances, would he change them? And if we do, what do we know he changed or what he didn't change?
I was going to say he would have changed them. We know that there are certain versions of Macbeth, for instance, and because he was one of the actors as well. Don't forget, he's in the first folio. It states that he was one of the actors. Probably he acted in all of them. He certainly acted in most of them to have got his name on that. And what happens, these things are constantly, I mean, Jake will know far more than I, but actually when you're watching a play appearing from a script into a performance, it's constantly being pulled and bashed about. And if the writer's there, it will be constantly annotated all the time. It will be changed. And I'm sure that's what he's doing. And what we've got here is a distillation of not just Shakespeare's mind, other directors' minds as well, coming in to produce a finished version. But nowadays, you've never seen a production the way Shakespeare did it, because the director has changed it. I mean, I've worked on things and seen them drop scenes, take chunks out, emphasize certain bits. When you think that Shakespeare is one of the few playwrights that's been acted in the Iron Curtain countries and actually in West Germany at the same time, using the same play to prove that both system is right. All they do is just take a few things out and emphasize a few other things.
Which play was that then, Alan? Which play was
Hamlet.
that?
Hamlet. No, it wasn't Hamlet. I think it was Macbeth.
Right.
Sure.
Well, I mean, so as a man who's worked in the theatre for 30 years and also worked with an awful lot of new playwrights, I can corroborate exactly what Alan's saying. And you can actually see at certain points how his mind worked. So I remember working on because there's lots of things to say about that, because he had a standing company of actors, and he wrote knowing who was going to play what and what their skills were. And what's lovely is if you trace the plays, you can start to work out who played what. So for instance, if you look at the comedies at the beginning, there's endless jokes and references to a tall blonde young woman and a short dark-haired young woman. There's a lot about that in Midsummer Night's Dream. There are jokes about Much Ado About Nothing. There are jokes about it in Twelfth Night, and I think also what's the other one? As You Like It. And that's because he had these two boys who played all these parts. And you can also see, for instance, that almost certainly sometimes they would draft someone in for skills, like the actor playing Tybalt only has 30 lines and they're all quite monosyllabic, probably because he wasn't an actor, but he was a brilliant swordsman.
Yes. Yeah.
And then there are bits where you can see quite clearly an actor's gone, my wife's having a baby, I don't want to be in this one, but give me something at the end, and he'll give you a scene. Or I remember when we were doing Much Ado About Nothing, one of the reasons why there are 3 different scenes in which characters say, Claudio and Hero are in love with each other, and they've all heard it in different places, is because he was probably rewriting and just never went back to correct things. But there's a wonderful scene in that which is completely extraneous, in which you have Beatrice and Beatrice and Hero just before the wedding, and Margaret and Ursula are there as well, and they all start making fun of Beatrice, and Margaret has quite a lot to say, and it doesn't need to be in the play. And I remember thinking, quite obviously, the actor playing Margaret went, I would like to have a scene. Would you please write me a scene here? So he went, all right, I'll write you a scene. So he knocked out a scene. And then later on, there's a similar one where Benedict comes to see Beatrice to say, I'm going to go and kill Claudio. And there's another big scene with Margaret, which has got no point except for a few jokes. So you can see him, but you can also see him get excited by the possibility of his actors. So there's this is the one that I love to quote. There are 2 very famous comic actors, Will Kemp, who was in all his early plays. So he was Lance in Two Gentlemen of Verona. He played Bottom. He probably played Falstaff. That's my hunch anyway. He played Costa in Love's Labour's Lost. And he tended to play working class, big, brawling, funny, often not very bright, but kind of big-hearted. And he died halfway through Shakespeare's career. So obviously he lost his great comic actor. And a second actor appeared called Robert Arnim. And Robert Arnim was a much more mercurial, intellectual, brilliant, witty, sharp, not a burly idiot clown, but much more a sort of he played Feste, he played Autolycus, and you can see him get get excited by Arnim, because there's a speech in the middle of Twelfth Night where Viola, who barely knows Feste, suddenly pays tribute to him. All these amazing things he can do. And then suddenly the fool appears in King Lear. And to me, you can see Shakespeare writing this play and going, okay, we're going to go further than anyone's ever gone with this comic character, and we're going to make him tragic. You've played Feste, you've played Touchstone, you've played all these wits. Now we're going to do something. And you create the fool who plays to all of Arnim's skills, but goes much, much deeper. Do you know what I mean? So there's definitely the fact that he was an actor was really important. And I think that's the interesting thing, is that he was an actor before he was a playwright. He wrote parts for himself. He was actually one of the leading actors after Burbage. He may have played Iago, he may have played Prospero.
He played the ghost, don't we, in Hamlet? Yeah,
but the ghost could also be twinned with Claudius. When my father did, he twinned the ghost with Claudius, and that was very interesting. So that stage went, and also if you look at the early plays, they're very scrappy and they're full of inspired things, but they don't hold together. Love's Labour's Lost has got all sorts of interesting things in it, but it's a bit of a mess.
A lot of Rosicrucianism in the ideas.
Absolutely,
quite a lot of hermetic ideas there.
But you can also see him pick up on, like, there's a play within a play in Love's Labour's Lost, which he does a lot better. In Night's Dream, and then Barone and Rosalind become Beatrice and Benedict. In Two Gentlemen of Verona, you've got women dressing up as men who then get used again. Proteus is a little bit like Iago. I mean, it's fascinating. He ransacks his original ideas and does them better, presumably hoping no one saw them or didn't remember. But I often again compare him to the Beatles. Like, the early Beatles are brilliant, but they're raw. Do you know what I mean? A very simple sound. And then late Beatles becomes complex and influenced by Hinduism and meditation and psychedelia, and you get, you know what I mean? It's anyway, I'm getting carried away, but I think his theatricality, his mad theatre quality is very much about and the fact, his idea that a lot of the characters are play acting, disguising who they are. Iago lies, Hamlet pretends to be mad. very much about, and then all those plays within a play, the play within a play, and Hamlet. What's real? What's not?
Wonderful roles to actors and stretching their skills. Yeah. Well, I mean, you'd have to say that I think he's developing in that sense more and more awareness of the nuances that we have in human life, and actually forming a team of people around him that could actually capture those things and represent them to an audience, which is quite something. And you show an audience, I mean, Eugene Halliday used to say to me, remember, it's called theatre, Alan, because it's the art. Yeah. All the others, it's visual, it's sonic, it's voice-based, it's constructive, it's intelligent. It's all these other arts. It's sculpture. It's moving. It's got rhythm and music. There's lots of dance would have been in the original thing. So it's all the arts combined together, and the audience is like consciousness watching a process going on in front of it. Yeah. So it's a wonderful encapsulation of, if you like, of what the universe is. Yeah. This whole thing is being witnessed by people, and they're being changed by what they see. If you don't leave the play. The playhouse, a different person when you went in. The playwright has missed his mark, and he's got to educate. He's got to pick you up from being raw at the beginning with lots of emotions that you can see straight forward, and then give you the nuances and the subtleties until at the end you are far more balanced. I would say you're meant to come out of it with far more intelligence than you went in. Magical, absolutely magical people processing.
Yeah. Well, I think your comment about transforming the audience, that takes you all the way back to what you said at the beginning about Ovid, and I think, of course, metamorphoses means transformations, and
yep.
and that again is what is so interesting about Shakespeare is he has magical transformations, like Bottom having an ass's head and then going back to being Bottom, but he also has interior psychological and emotional transformations where characters are transformed by what happens to them and how they interact with each other. And I think that must have been, that again is linked to the alchemical idea of the transmutation of base lead into gold.
Yeah.
Gold, becoming purified and more advanced. And
it's
I think
interesting as well. Sorry, just before you leave Bottom, when he comes out of that transformation, he actually mangles St. Paul. He actually says what it is. I thought what I saw. I've got it written down somewhere. There's a piece by St. Paul which is saying.
Is that now I see through a glass darkly and now face to face?
Not quite. If you give me a minute, I'll find it. It's in. This is my thesis, by the way. I'll find it because I know roughly where it should be. Talk amongst yourselves, and I'll try.
Okay, because what I'd like to come in here, what is intriguing me, as particularly the historian part of me, is the opportunity to really appreciate, and I think it's the first time I've ever done this, of taking the role. There was a group of historians in the 1930s in France called Lani, with people like Marc Bloch and Ferdinand Braudel. And they were a group of historians that really wanted to say, look, we can do history of kings and queens, but what we really need to be looking at is the history of what it was like there at that time, living then. And I think for the first time, you guys have made me appreciate the theatre in Jacobean times and in Elizabethan times, and how it morphed and developed. And I was particularly interested in the fascinating thing that I'd never ever realized before, that a soliloquy is an inner dialogue where the audience appreciates what is happening in the mind of the actor, and realize that the soliloquy is not being heard by all the other people. And of course, this is only a device, that it's very difficult to get across, isn't it? Even in movies and films these days, it's very difficult to know what somebody's thinking. And I was then thinking, well, were other playwrights doing similar, or was really Shakespeare the first one that did that?
He was, well, when I say he was the first one, and this is the other, we're talking about influences. Obviously, Shakespeare was incredibly influenced by all the other playwrights that were writing around him. No one took it to the level of sophistication that Shakespeare did. If you look at Marlowe's plays, say you take a play like Dr. Faustus, which is one of the most powerful plays that Marlowe wrote. It opens with a speech, but it's not quite the same thing as, and it ends with a speech, Marlowe's famous, Faustus's famous speech, but it's not quite the same thing as one of Hamlet's speeches, where the whole point is that the character can only open his heart to the audience because there's nobody else on the stage. That first time Hamlet says, "Oh, this too solid, oh, that this too solid flesh should melt." What is it? Thaw, melt, I can't remember what it is, resolve itself into a dew. Yeah. He has to wait for the stage to empty before he can say it. Whereas when Faustus is opens Faustus, he's just saying, yeah, here I am, boom. Do you know what I mean? And you don't get it in Greek tragedy. In Greek tragedy, you sometimes have a speech at the beginning of the play, but everything else in Greek tragedy is public because you've always got the chorus on stage, which can hear everything that's being said. So you never seem to remember. Sorry? And
responds to it as well, don't they? Yes. Yes,
exactly.
I would agree. In fact, in Hamlet as well, you get him changing his mind. You know, yes. you see him thinking to be or not to be. That's the question. Whether it is not, and he's pushing and pulling against ideas, and leaning in this way and leaning that way. Well, I mean, I'm thinking of, you know,
but also doing that. It tends to also be pulling against action. So in something like Webster or Tunner, you get characters telling you how they're feeling. I hate this man, I want to kill him because he's vile. But with Shakespeare, the character is usually in a state of crisis. You know what I mean? So it's either Macbeth going, I really can't kill Duncan, or it's Hamlet going, I can't kill anyone. They're interestingly not many soliloquies in King Lear. In Othello, it's Iago working out what he's going to do. Do you see what I mean? So it's a very dynamic mental process that by the end of the soliloquy, the performer or the character has started in one place and ended somewhere else. And they just go much deeper than anyone else. So to me, and also Shakespeare in the other plays, characters hide what they're feeling. But with Shakespeare creates the first introverted man who can't communicate their feelings to other people. Hamlet can't ever tell Ophelia what's really going on. He can't share with Horatio. He can't share with anybody. And it's absolutely baffling in Macbeth, whereby Lady Macbeth is on the outside of Macbeth's mind throughout the whole play. The big speeches that Macbeth gives, she is not privy to. She's not privy to. Maybe I shouldn't do this. It's a terrible thing to do. What's really interesting is that you know, the famous "Is this a dagger that I see before me?" He does tell her about that because she references it much later. When he thinks he's seeing Banquo's ghost, she says, "This is the dagger that you saw floating in front of you." But obviously, instead of going, "Well, this is exactly what I went through," with his famous speech he just went, "And then I saw a dagger floating," and she went, "What is nonsense?" So he can't communicate. That goes back to your point, Alan, about consciousness. He's writing about particularly men, because the women have different dilemmas, who cannot open themselves to people.
Yeah,
either because they're ashamed of what they're thinking, or they're afraid that if they show it, they'll be hurt.
Yes.
Othello can never properly tell Desdemona why he thinks she's been unfaithful, because it terrifies him to do it. You know what I mean? And the very first play he wrote, Two Gentlemen of Verona, has got the most disturbing comic hero, Proteus, who is a really nasty piece of work.
Yeah.
But he's at the center of the play, and he is the first of Shakespeare's characters who wants to do something awful but knows he shouldn't do it, but still does it. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
The character's called Proteus, who was a shapeshifter.
Yes.
So very, very complex. Do you know what I mean?
You know, I keep thinking, and I know the timing is wrong here in terms of the historical perspective, but all the time I'm referring my mind back to Julian Jaynes and the bicameral mind, and the idea of the inner dialogue that Julian Jaynes argued up until we became bicameral, you know, after the Iliad, that the inner dialogue was the voice of the gods that were guiding us in one way or another. And I'm thinking here that, you know, Shakespeare was doing something just as revolutionary, in the sense he was realizing that there's conflict in everybody else's heads, and we are debating it all the time within ourselves, and we have the capability to change, you know.
Yes.
And it must have been and again, I keep coming back to, you know, what the hoi polloi made of all this incredibly deep thinking, and how one man just sitting there writing a play could be so utterly profound in what he was writing. And I don't believe for 1 minute that we're embroidering this because we're looking back and looking at his work and taking it apart and analyzing it, because it's self-evident from what you're saying. This is exactly what his intention was. And it's extraordinary, isn't it? And again, it comes back down to, you know, was it because he was interested in esoteric beliefs, that, you know, the inner person was something that, you know, people like John Dee maybe talked him into or taught him or whatever? And you can see the depths are just profound. And I found this whole discussion, I've been quiet because I've been sitting here astonished at listening to an exchange of ideas by two extraordinary thinkers about another extraordinary thinker. And I'm aware that we're sort of probably running towards the end now, but what I'd like to do is, you know, for the final 20 minutes, half an hour, is, Jake, if you could discuss a little bit more about the project you're doing now at Durham, and a little bit more about your intentions for this. And then maybe, Alan, if you could finish off with one or two anecdotes from your experiences in Shakespeare, and one or two things that maybe you discovered when you were doing your PhD on A Midsummer Night's Dream that you could draw in to the more to the interest of the more esoteric listeners here.
Okay.
Sure. So yes. So it was when I approached you, didn't I, about this, Anthony? I run a theatre company up in the northeast called Elysium Theatre Company. I married someone who lives up here, my wife, who's a classicist, classics tutor, expert on Ovid, absolutely loves Ovid, and a wonderful translator of Latin poetry, actually, when I'm urging her to translate both Ovid and Virgil. So we named the company after Elysium, which is the Greek name for the divine realms of the ancient Greeks. We've done a lot of work, but when I first moved up here, I don't know if you know Durham, but there's the central kind of heart of it is the wonderful cathedral, the castle, which is now a college, the Cozzens Library, where the copy of the first folio is being held, and another building, I can't remember what the other building is, cafe I think it is now, but it's an old Victorian stone building. And Palace Green is this beautiful piece of green grass. And when I first moved up here, I thought, gosh, it'd be perfect to do a Shakespeare here, open air Shakespeare, in this magical, hugely fascinating, resonant place. We got your Norman Cathedral, etc., etc. We didn't have the resources. And then we slowly, with our work, have been building up our profile. We have a following, and we're also building up a relationship with the university. And this year was the anniversary of the 400th anniversary of the folio. And they approached us, and we'd also been approached by the Durham Fringe Festival to do something which would bring all this together. And immediately it was like, well, the obvious thing to do is some Shakespeare, just saying. So we're launching the Durham Shakespeare Festival, and we want it to be an annual thing. We want it to be something that starts to build up. So we're doing it on a shoestring this year, because inevitably you always do the first time. But the ultimate goal is to create something which might have a national profile, like the Cambridge Shakespeare Festival or the old Ludlow Shakespeare Festival, which really is there also for the wider region and is also for the county itself. We really want to draw the county into this because we want a big cultural event. And we're doing Macbeth, and we're doing Midsummer Night's Dream, and it's 13 actors. We're proud to say we have 3 actors from Durham itself, the county itself. We have a lot of northeastern actors and a group of actors who have been part of our core ensemble for a while. And we're performing Macbeth at the most wonderful building called Usher House, then in the centre of Durham at the Assembly Rooms. Then Midsummer Night's Dream will open, and then we'll do them all on Palace Green in a tent in the last week as part of the Fringe Festival. And the goal is to celebrate Shakespeare. We're also producing with the university 10 podcasts with 6 famous actors. We've got Edward Fox, Derek Jacobi, Robert Lindsay, actors like that, then academics talking about different aspects of Shakespeare. And we're also going out to schools. We're offering workshops with a whole thing called what we call Shakespeare for All policy, because Shakespeare is still seen as elitist, and it shouldn't be. As I say, if there's one big take home from this conversation is that he did write for ordinary people, working class people who couldn't read. And the other thing I wanted to say is, with all the discussion about the esoteric, the brilliance of the plays is they're very embodied. They're in a real recognizable world where people eat and drink and fight and, do you know what I mean, fall over and all these things. And we're hoping it will create a head of steam. We're very excited about it and we want to create that Shakespearean magic. We have a wonderful group of actors. You've got, with me, 30 years of marinating thoughts about Shakespeare, even longer than that, probably 35 years, including the wisdom of my father and all sorts of other people. So it's in one sense slightly kamikaze, because, you know, if we fall flat on our face, we fall flat on our face. Or it could be something that is really opens something up for the Northeast, because Shakespeare's not performed professionally up here. Northeastern people don't get to see it. If they want to see Shakespeare, they have to go to Stratford, they have to go to London, which is hundreds of pounds. And Northeastern actors don't get a chance to perform in it. And the big question has to be, why not? You know, why are whole regions of our country denied access to great theatre, to great playwrights? Why? Do we think they're stupid? Do we think they're unworthy? So there's a real mission to go, no, we think this is where we want to do it, and these are the people we want to do it with, and these are the people we want to do it for.
That's excellent.
I hope you're, from the bottom of my heart, I hope you're successful. Northern Broadsides were a big effect on me when I was growing up. To actually see the plays done in northern accents for a start changed a hell of a lot, and to actually take it and place them in Durham would be magnificent. Wonderful setting for them. Wonderful setting.
Thank you.
Yeah,
I think that would be really great. Now, I was reminded, of seeing when we first met, when your father and I attended your production in the German theatre of I Have Been Here Before, all those years ago. And your technique of bringing the play alive, I really thoroughly enjoyed. So I'd be really fascinated to take the opportunity maybe to see one or two of your plays as well. I would love to do that. Right, okay, Alan, in terms of we've had a very wide-ranging discussion in terms of Shakespeare in the occult, and I'd just like to give you the opportunity to chat a little bit about your discoveries in terms of the esoteric and Shakespeare, in terms of probably the Tempest and A Midsummer Night's Dream, areas that we haven't touched upon, that you think that probably would be of interest to our watchers or our listeners. Watchers, I keep thinking, gosh, yes, the egregores, from the past and the magical traditions as well. But Alan, putting the ball over to you.
Right. Well, I think one of the things which has constantly fascinated me about Shakespeare and the supernatural, I'm scaring a little bit away from the word occult, but obviously it involves that as well, is the way that he uses it almost like a hint of glamour. And I think it works because, as Jake has said, the films that we watch and which are popular, incredibly popular, have got this hint of this magical glamour of this world has got more potential than you think. It isn't just bricks and mortar. It isn't just material, and more, and I think this is pressing now. The material world is breaking down in physics, etc. It doesn't seem to hold water. It's the world is more of a dream than a substance. And if you like, this is what theatre's always said. You're seeing something in which time is disjointed, sometimes disjointed completely, moved backwards to forwards. And Shakespeare does with plays, in Winter's Tale, he plays around with time, and he has the whole concept of before and after causality turned upside down in several plays. So we have him playing about with ideas that say, human beings are much more than we think of them. They're not mundane and they're not ordinary. And what's more, I can drag the public in to see this shimmering sort of more than, but even if I don't actually define it for you, if I just give you hints of it, like Julius Caesar saying, his wife coming to say, I had a dream. You shouldn't go to the forum today. To hell with you, woman. I can't, Caesar can't be listening to rubbish like this. I've got business, all this sort of stuff. It gives an echo. You see things on the TV which just allow a little bit of the supernatural in, because people sort of have got that level in them. It's like Rupert Sheldrake saying, the number of scientists that sidle over to him and say, I have seen a few things, that I can't talk about in the common room. And, I'd like to talk about them to you. And he'd say, well, talk about them in the common room. You'll find that just about everybody, has hears voices occasionally and sees things which are not, this is a human proclivity. And that I think Shakespeare captured it really well. He doesn't push it at you. You can take it as just a device, if you like. It deepens the plays, and it gives them this sparkle and shine so that we want to respond to them. And it's part of being human. We have edges that go out into the mysterious. Tony and I, we talk about this all the time, and we're trying to nail it down. Maybe it never will be nailed down. Maybe it will never be able to grab hold of it. It will slip through our fingers. But, like with the play, and I said, when you come to that thing about Orion, well, did Shakespeare know that? Or did it just actually come out of race memory? Is it just part of the thing that what happens at the summertime? We have this midsummer madness that just happens to coincide with this constellation that moves through us. Or does astrology literally have a potent force? The Hermeticists would have said it's the first thing that God did was he created this great zodiacal belt of animals to give us a symbolic sort of archetypes for the way life would go on a yearly basis. We've got this whole level of inspiration, which we don't have to accept 100%, but if we allow it even just 4 or 5%, it gives a shimmer to our life and gives us a degree of magic that brings us along and helps us to be more human. I think that is what makes us human, that we aren't mundane and we aren't material and we aren't just matter. There's more sparkle to us, a little bit of glitter.
Well, that's an interesting thing. Again, when I was saying earlier about the fact that the Renaissance was pre-industrial, pre-Enlightenment, of course, the key Renaissance concept was man as microcosm of the macrocosm. So the idea was that the human being, which goes back to Augustine, which goes back to Jewish thinkers, etc., or Plato, was that we humans were a microcosmic. We were material and spirit. We were everything: imagination, creativity. If you wanted to understand the cosmos, you studied oneself.
Yeah.
But that was got rid of by the Enlightenment, where it became much more about, no, we're parts of a machine, we're part of a system, change the system and we will change. And a very, very different view of who we are. And I think that
I agree.
With the classic thing of Renaissance humanism, that you can't take the spiritual and the supernatural out of the Renaissance. The whole idea was that everything could be expressed as a hymn to God. Music could be, architecture could be, poetry could be, and I think it's a really important thing, certainly in the theatre, because you're going back into pre-modern cultures. You have to think of about that way of looking at it if you're going to get the emotional power out of the material. And it's rather like saying, you don't have to believe in ghosts to play Hamlet's ghosts. You don't have to believe in witches to make the witches in Macbeth scary, in much the same way that you don't have to believe that Daleks exist if you're appearing as an actor in Doctor Who. Do you know what I mean? It's whether you take it literally, or as you say, whether it's a heightened device to create drama and a powerful emotional reaction.
And I think that's what Shakespeare is doing. I think that's why he deliberately sets the play in Greece, classical Greece, and then talks in local English. He talks in the Forest of Arden. but he's taken us, so he's gone pre-Christian. So, okay, I can get away with a few sexy things here because that the church wouldn't normally let me say, because I'm talking about the Greeks, and we know that they were pre-Christian, so they didn't have the benefit of the Savior and the whole of the church. So I can go a little bit pre-church, and I can say these things, and then I can dump us all in the village, just outside of Stratford-on-Avon, and we'll see this thing working out. And they're using the same bloody symbols as they did in classical Greece. So if it's beautifully allowing this thing to be mentioned and talked about and played with, because it's only a dream.
And it's right.
Pure entertainment, only entertainment now.
And
Please
it's only
don't cut my head off.
if it was a tragedy, you might need to take it seriously. But there's something interesting to say about that is I didn't discover until recently that the whole pagan world coexisted with the Christian world in England long after Shakespeare died. And in fact, you talked about the fertility rites in Midsummer Night's Dream. It was a universe. You see it in Lorca, and you also see it. There's a Russian film, I don't know if you know Andrei Rublev by Andrei Tarkovsky. There was a universal pagan rite around the time of Midsummer Night's Dream, where country populations would run into the local forest or go into the fields, and they would have what we'd now call a mass orgy. The idea was that they take their clothes off and they'd take hallucinogens and they'd have sex with each other, and it was a way of mixing up the gene pool and fertility and all this kind of stuff. Well, I'm not joking, because if you read Yerma by Lorca, the last act, because Yerma is about a young Spanish woman who can't conceive a child. In the last act, she goes to a thing called the Romero, I think it's, or the Romelio, which was basically a pagan festival in Catalonia or Granada, where exactly that happened. And the whole idea was, she's told, go to that, find a man, have sex with him, conceive a child, and you'll have a baby. It doesn't matter that it won't be your husband's, you'll just have a baby. And she goes and she can't do it. She freezes, and I just can't do it. It's wrong. This is wrong. So it existed all the way into the 20th century. But the point with England was it was Cromwell who stopped all that.
Right.
So Cromwell actually banned and made it illegal all across the country to observe any of the old folk pagan rites. So this is the fascinating thing. Shakespeare might not have had to have read a book to be able to write A Midsummer Night's Dream. He would have known that it would have gone on.
Yes.
The countryside, which is fascinating.
That is a fascinating piece of cultural history, isn't it? The idea. I mean, I'm reading more. I'm very heavily into hauntology at the moment, and the concept of the English countryside and the symbolism of the English countryside. And that really resonates with me. And I think, as a final comment, I think I have to say this has been a most extraordinary exchange of ideas. I have enjoyed every single minute of it. And I've learned so much, and I'd like to thank you both. But I think, as a parting statement, before we ask for people if they want to contact both of you, is the very famous statement by Julian James, the British astronomer, when he said it's coming to the conclusion that the universe is looking less and less like a great machine and more like a great thought or a great consciousness. And I think Shakespeare is very much telling us that. This is one of the central messages of Shakespeare, is that everything is thought. The primary of everything is consciousness. But I still think that wonderful line, that our life is just a piece of nothing surrounded by a dream. And I just think that is just so, so powerful. And I'd just like to thank you guys, because we've nearly done 2 hours, and it's been absolutely extraordinary. There have been no lacuna. This has been an extraordinary exchange of ideas. So very quickly, Jake, if anybody wants to contact you or wants to look up your website or anything, or come along to the events in Durham, what do they need to do?
If you go to our website, which is www.elysiumtc.co.uk, I'll say that again, www.elysiumtc.co.uk, Elysium spelled ELYSIUM. There's a way of messaging us there. That will come straight through to me. You can also find out details about the Shakespeare Festival on there. If you click on what's on, all the information, all the dates of the shows and how you can book for them appear there.
Wonderful. Okay, Alan, and in terms of your work, I know that you know the work you do at Tallygarth and everything else as well, plus your other work. Is there, and anybody, your website and anything else that you'd like to reference here?
Well, there's some stuff up on the website, but Tallygarth is the place where I'm actually sort of working. I'm doing something every month, I think, this year. And part of them I've got into here. But I'd just like to, to wish Jake, every luck, and may all the winds be in your sails for this, because it's a great thing that you're doing. Absolutely great. And I hadn't realized, I'd noticed unconsciously, that Shakespeare seemed to be retreating from the theatres and just not appearing. Certainly, since COVID as well, I've not heard of it, hardly any. And it would be a tremendous loss to lose the man.
Yes, I agree.
Absolutely. And I totally agree. Okay, well, everybody, thanks for listening in. This will be placed on, this has been recorded and it will be slightly edited and it will be placed on my YouTube channel for free viewing forever. And I think it's such an important document in terms of Shakespearean studies that I think it probably would like to believe this is going to be a reference for many people for many, many years to come. I would like to think that probably universities and A-level students would find it of profound interest. And I'm sure that had I known the things I'd learned today when I was doing A-level English literature 50 years ago, that this would have been of great interest to me as well. So thank you both for your time and thank you for sharing your wonderful ideas with us. And hopefully we will see everybody else who's been listening in live again soon.